Dr. Benjamin Tallis is a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. He runs the project Action Group Zeitenwende on the transformation of Germany's security and foreign policy, and where he hosts the podcast Berlin Inside Out. He previously worked for the EU on security missions in Ukraine and the Balkans, and was policy officer at the European Centre of Excellence for Civilian Crisis Management in Berlin. Benjamin spent 5 years at the Institute of International Relations Prague, where he headed the Centre for European Security and advised numerous European governments, edited the journal New Perspectives as well. Benjamin regularly appears in the media and has been published in Foreign Policy, Politico, The Independent, and in leading academic journals. He is the author of 2 books, To Ukraine with Love, Essays on Russia's War and Europe's Future in 2022, and he has also written Identities, Borderscapes, Orders in Security and Mobility and Crisis in the EU and Ukraine, 2023. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our incredible speakers. And if you like the content, do please consider becoming a patron or buy me a coffee to help support the work of the channel. But I've looked forward for a long time to have you on the channel, Benjamin, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've followed Silicon Curtain for a while, and thanks for your perseverance as well as your patience in getting me on and finding it a mutually convenient time.
No, absolutely. It's a huge pleasure to do this. And of course, it comes at a critical phase in the war. And I don't know if you sort of feel this, but certainly in those that are following it and commenting on Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on, and are engaged in activism, there seems to be a change in tone, a change in urgency. Does that reflect a kind of a sort of pivotal moment or a point where perhaps decisions and strategies need to change?
Yes, it does, for two main reasons. One is that we're running up against what we call manufactured fatigue in a lot of Western societies that have done enough to support Ukraine to make sure that it's not lost the war against Russia, but haven't done enough to make sure that it will win yet. And the politicians who are keen to actually stall that process, who don't want to see the kind of change, the kind of systemic change that Ukrainian victory would actually bring about, that i.e. the acceleration of systemic competition, rivalry between democracies and autocracies worldwide, they're often hiding behind what they claim is public fatigue, or they're putting their attention elsewhere. So manufactured fatigue is part of this. Also, the genuine lack of policymakers' bandwidth at the moment, while dealing with the multiple unfolding crises that we see, is, to be honest, there is a genuine part to that. There's also part of that that's being used as an excuse, because if you couldn't get the very simple, obvious, clear thing right in Ukraine, there's very little chance you're going to get the more complex thing in the Middle East right, for example. But all this has meant that Ukraine has fallen down some of the news agendas a little bit. And also, we've seen that the war itself is progressing in a more slow fashion. And the now famous interview with Valery Zaluzhny, talking about a stalemate or a war of position that's developed, really puts a fine point on saying our current track of the war for Ukraine and its allies, that's all of us in the West, is not pointing to a quick Ukrainian victory. Now, that's really problematic for a number of reasons, and we have to change it. We have to push that course back to supporting a full Ukrainian victory, and the time to do that is now.
And I saw you shared a fascinating quote by Garry Kasparov, I think, which really puts the onus on this. He says that we should be doing everything to help Ukraine defeat Russia as quickly as possible, and this is the clearest mandate the free world has been given since the end of the Cold War. Many people have, of course, compared that to the moral cause of the Second World War. And obviously many conflicts since then have had a much higher degree of sort of ambiguity around them. But he also points out that this is not a failure of capacity, not a failure of strength, but a failure of will. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, very, very much so. I think Garry is absolutely on point in that, and he's been one of the most astute analysts of this war, as well as long being one of the strongest voices on Russia. So I think the tragedy of this situation is there is that moral clarity. It is very clear who is right and wrong in this situation. It's also very clear who stands to win and lose, who stands to benefit or not from either, on one hand, Ukraine's victory, or on the other hand, Russia's victory. Nobody benefits from a frozen conflict. Nobody benefits from a stalemate. And the real problem here that we see at the moment in Germany, but also elsewhere, is that policymakers are not properly factoring in the costs of that stalemate situation, the costs of that freezing of the conflict, which bakes in almost all of the costs of a defeat, actually, because it doesn't send a proper signal to authoritarians around the world that we are willing to stand up for our values, because it means that Russia isn't again going to be not properly deterred, because it therefore creates a threat, a direct threat to Europeans and to European security. It prevents the creation of a stable security order in Europe, which means that we're going to have to spend a lot more on defense, rather than spending that on things such as fighting climate change, mastering our technological transformation, and improving our societies, fixing the cracks in our societies, we might add. So we bake in all those costs by pushing towards a frozen conflict. We do our morals no good whatsoever, and we give a feather in the cap to those who are our enemies.
Does it also, I mean, there are multiple costs that implies. There's also the cost, isn't there, of sustaining the Ukrainian economy when it is not a whole and inviolable territory. And therefore, the speed, pace, and scale of reconstruction and regeneration of that economy is going to be far slower, potentially, if it doesn't regain its territories. First, I'll get you to address that cost, but then there's another really interesting, more strategic cost after that. But yeah, if I can ask you to comment on that one first.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is one of the ultimate false economies, and we've seen a Western approach driven by false economy, the idea that you can save a little in the short term, but actually it will end up costing you a lot more in the long term. That's been the case with military support, the drip approach that's gone through. If we'd provided what Ukraine needed at the time it needed it last year, we wouldn't be talking about this conflict anymore. This conflict would already be past, and we would be firmly into the reconstruction phase. Exactly what you said, Jonathan, about reconstruction. The longer we put it off, the longer we defer Ukraine's return to territorial integrity to its 1991 borders, the longer we defer Ukrainian victory, the more expensive and the more futile reconstruction will be. We'll have to keep going in and rebuilding the same things. We will have to face a situation where Ukrainians themselves don't see a country worth returning to because they will continue to see the threat of Russia. This is really the lose-lose situation of all. We will be spending a huge amount of money for very little gain. So I think this is yet more of the flawed thinking and a real false economy on part of the West. And as Garry Kasparov mentioned, that's not due to capacity. We could afford this, and we should be paying for this, but too many of our leaders actually don't want to.
If we continue that idea that we have adopted a bean counter strategy, there's another potential flaw in that, isn't there? It assumes that there may well be a stasis or a return to the status quo, even in the event of a frozen conflict or not a clear outcome. But in fact, what you have on the border there is a revanchist Russia that has proved itself far more capable at information or digital warfare, at dividing and conquering. Is the costs of resisting that, or indeed the costs of that being successful and weakening our political systems and our political consensus, is the cost of that even a consideration here?
It again doesn't seem to be being priced in properly. And I know you had Ben Hodges on the show recently, who has very well made the case that the cost of failed deterrence is much higher always than the cost of successful deterrence. And he's absolutely right with that. And that comes in a number of forms. It comes in the form of military deterrence, but also deterrence against the kind of hybrid threats and the kind of destabilization activity that we've seen Russia engage with, actively taking hostile, active measures against our societies. And yet still some cling to the illusion that this would be some kind of peaceful scenario where we could manage Russia. Nothing in the conduct of those states in the West shows me that we could manage Russia, because again, we're not properly deterring Russia there. Now, there's a strange thing happening at the same time, which is that we see in Europe a lot of worry about the future of the US security guarantee, which is a big part of the hard security deterrence that we have against Russia. Yet at the same time, we also don't see the kind of military buildup or the kind of talk that would give credence to that being a real worry. In Germany, it's been particularly talked about. It's endlessly talked about. The doomy scenarios for what will happen when Trump 2 or a Trump-like figure comes in are constantly pervaded before us. Yet we don't see Germany taking its rearmament seriously. We don't see discussions about extended deterrence, i.e., making sure Germany has nuclear coverage. If they were genuinely worried about this, then we would see much more of that. We would see discussions with the UK or with France about extending their deterrence properly to Germany, or even about the development of a German or European nuclear deterrent itself. We don't. So what I think this points to is, on two sides, a real complacency and a desire to go back to the status quo, to save as much of the world of yesterday as they possibly can, basically to get back to trade, to get back to the lazy reading of the end of history, where you could just trade with everybody and everything would be fine. It's a real fingers crossed approach, and it is it's going to be disastrous, I think.
And do you think the labels that you sometimes get in the way? We look at Russia as an authoritarian state, Putin's dictator, etc., and placing those labels on it hides all sorts of complexity. Some causes for optimism and some causes for pessimism, but it doesn't convey the complex story. And in particular, I mean here that this isn't just a clash between leaders or stars of leadership, but this is more of a clash of in some videos, we've called it civilizational values or the entire political system. In other videos, we refer to it as a fundamental clash of business models. And that is that the Russian world extraction economy business model with military companies and so on, that tends to feed on chaos. That tends to be able to make profit out of instability. Whereas our economic system depends on certainty, rule of law, stability, free trade routes, and so on. Do you detect in Germany and around Europe that people are looking beyond the simplistic labels and understanding that this is a far deeper clash and a far more threatening one?
I don't think enough people have got that message yet. I think there are some, and across all the political parties in Germany, there are people who get it. There's perhaps fewer in the SPD than in some of the other parties. There's many in the CDU who don't get it as well, and there's many across all the parties that don't get it. The problem is that with the SPD calling the shots, having the chancellery, and foreign and security policy being very much what in Germany Olaf Scholz is called Chefsache, or the boss's stuff to deal with. It is most important that those in the SPD don't get it. But I think also this is something that German people do get to a significant extent. And a lot of research that we have access to shows that people worry about geopolitics and geoeconomics and the connection between them. They don't use those words, they don't use those terms, but they know that this fight for values, that this fight about democracy and freedom does connect to their economic prospects. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head when you talk about our model of prosperity requiring order and Russia's model of prosperity requiring disorder. Now, we haven't also done that perfectly in the past. We can look at the period of Western hegemony after the end of the Cold War, particularly with the US as the linchpin of that. And that, for many people, wasn't a period of stability, of course. And we can see that we got a lot of things wrong in terms of how we went about trying to export democracy or impose democracy. But I think lessons have been learned from that. And understanding that now we have to secure our base, we have to secure the core of the democratic world, and do as much as we can to keep the global commons protected, the kind of trade routes that you mentioned, the sea lanes, etc., and the global infrastructure we depend on, while also engaging in a competition to provide global public goods, order of different kinds, peace, justice, etc., and material well-being to the swing states in the middle, the ones who we might want to try and bring into our camp. But fundamentally, that means we have to be an attractive model ourselves. We have to actually provide that attractive beacon. And that fundamentally means that kind of defense. And that means realizing the kind of enemy we're up against, exactly as you said.
And you made an interesting comment, I think, recently that Boris Pistorius has announced a doubling of Germany's military commitment. We already know that the civilian commitment, financial commitment is incredibly high, but the military commitment is going to increase. Do you think that is aligned with a clear strategy, or is it still, a set of numbers or a set of capabilities, not necessarily aligned with a clear strategic goal?
It's a matter of debate whether muddling through is a strategy or not. It's a deliberate choice at this stage, but is it truly strategic for Germany and its allies? I mean, I and many others would think it's the wrong strategy, and it's a misguided strategy based on a miscalculation of interest. But at this point, this has been going on so long that I think we have to say there is an element of strategic thinking in that. And I think it's about trying not to provoke that level of change that I mentioned before, not to allow what would happen if a Ukrainian victory were to take place, which that this would become a system transforming war and a global system transforming war. What does that mean? It would mean that acceleration and cementing of the conflict between the kind of value systems that you mentioned and between the economic models that you mentioned before. And that's something that Germany's leadership, especially around the Chancellery, the Chancellor and his advisors, have been extremely keen to avoid. So I think the strategy is basically continuation of as much of the past as possible. It's a continuity strategy. And to do that, they provide enough aid for Ukraine not to lose, but not enough that it might win. And again, it's also about providing what. It remains to be seen what that 8 billion will actually buy. Is that going to be the kind of offensive weapons that would help clear the Russians off Ukrainian turf? Or is it going to be air defense and the kind of things that will do a good job, a useful job in protecting Ukrainian cities, but the kind of job that wouldn't be needed to be done if we went out and won the war?
This is it, and Taurus is critical in that debate, isn't it? Because it's an offensive capability rather than a defensive capability.
Yes, I mean the debate in Germany about defensive and offensive weapons and so on took on a vaguely comic quality at various points when, you know, if you threw a tank hard enough, a stationary tank, could it be defensive, offensive, whatever. But in this case, there's no doubt. Taurus is there to go and whack Russian assets. It's there eventually to help take out the Kerch Bridge. It's there to take out the Russian air defense that the Black Sea Fleet depends on. It's there to take out the Black Sea Fleet itself. It's there to hit the logistics hubs that keep the Russian operation going and have allowed them to dig in such a serious way. And it's remarkable to me and many of the leading defense and security analysts in Germany that still we see the same arguments that were made last year for not providing Leopard tanks as we now hear about Taurus. The latest one, which Edward Stringer, who's a wonderful defense expert from the UK, former deputy chief of the UK defense staff, referred to as the cod intellectual justification for this is Boris Pistorius last week. And lest there be misunderstood, Pistorius has been one of the better figures in this debate, particularly from the SPD. So it was particularly embarrassing to see him regurgitate a line from last year from Wolfgang Schmidt, one of the Chancellor's advisors, about Wunderwaffe or wonder weapons, miracle weapons. The point about Taurus is it could do all those things I mentioned before, but it's not on its own the game changer that changes the war. It's part of an incremental process of providing the weapons needed to degrade Russian capacity and push Ukraine to victory over time. It's not that this would be the one. It's part of the stay. It's one step on the way. And to hear excuse after excuse, which are only excuses, given to a public which is now quite educated, given to a political audience that is extremely educated on this, is really an embarrassment for the German government.
The other aspect of this, and this is more speculative, but is that the other concern, of course, there's nuclear weapons, there's the fear of what Russia might do and the nuclear threats, etc. Although, as you say, if you listen to Ben Hodges and others, they have quite effectively pulled apart that nuclear terroristic message. There is perhaps a more pernicious hand in this, and this is the sort of the cold hand of late period Kissinger type theorizing, and that is that you cannot imagine a world without Russia. Russia is a constituent part of the global mechanism which would fly apart if Russia didn't exist. Is there some calculus here to preserve Russia and not allow it to collapse, whatever that means?
Well, I think there's a lot of confused thinking about that. And if it is cold-bloodedness, it's a strange kind of cold-bloodedness. There's a history of this kind of thinking in Germany, as you mentioned. And there's a wonderful phrase who was thrown at one of the founders of my organization, Wilhelm Graeber, who was a big thinker on foreign policy in the 50s, wrote the Hallstein Doctrine, helped write the the German Re-Sovereignty Treaty and so on and so forth. He was described as having a cold-blooded Hanseaticness at some point. Wonderful phrase by a German historian. But in this case, I think anything like that is really misguided. It's not a cold-bloodedness. If you wish to continue to see a world of great powers, revanchist great powers with imperial ambitions run by fascists, then that's something else. I mean, that should be called what it is. I mean, that's indulgence of dictatorship and indulgence of fascism. And that's the kind of thing that we, certainly most of us think Germany has got over. So I don't think there is any real will to do that. I think where the two blur is indeed this is the fear of Russian collapse, or the fear of the collapse of the current regime. And what this does, I think it's mistaken in a number of ways. It puts a premium on stability where over instability and the uncertainty as to what would come, while accepting the very certain damage that Russia is doing and will continue to do, which I find a remarkable calculation for anyone to make. Also, if you speak to anyone who grew up on the wrong side, the east side of the Iron Curtain, then they will tell you that stability isn't all it's cracked up to be. Stability has real costs for people on the ground. It's not just some universal good. So I think there's a certain sort of hardness of stomach to some of this stuff that says, yes, but we can bear that on behalf of others. And the others, of course, don't get a say in that. But there's also, I think, that miscalculation about putting certainty of harm over the uncertainty of what may be to come. What it also does is play into Russian exceptionalism in a really dangerous way by saying there could be no Russia that was democratically governed, that Russia must be allowed its empire because look at that's the only way it can be. I mean, nonsense. This is the kind of Russian exceptionalism that we hear Russian chauvinists purporting all the time. We are so special, let us get away with especially awful behavior. No, you're people like anyone else. I mean, you have bad governance, terrible history, terrible record of assaulting your neighbors and doing great harm to yourselves. But nonetheless, you remain people. And none of us were democratic until we were. None of us were liberal until we were. And the same can be and should be applied to Russia. And I think so we should be looking for ways to make that happen, even if it's not our prime concern. Our prime concern is deterring, containing, and isolating the current Russia to make sure it doesn't do harm. But there is nothing to prevent a Russia developing in a democratic way in the future. Now, if it were to do that, would it still act like a revanchist, chauvinist, imperialist great power? If it did, then it has to be dealt with in the same way. But we don't tend to see that from democratic states, and we don't tend to see that from liberal states. So I think we have to bear those things in mind when weighing up this calculation.
And Russia is, I mean, we all are good at creating mythologies to turn ourselves into the good guys. No country is immune from that. Russia seems to be particularly expert at spinning self-decepting mythologies to allow it to carry on with these aggressive behaviors. One of the more pernicious ones, and one that has been readily, I think, accepted, unfortunately, around the world, is the idea of good Russians and bad Russians, and somehow you can divide the one from the other. That also perhaps prevents us taking clear action and making Russians culpable. I say in the collective political sense, even those who have opposed the regime. And I'm not hugely versed in political philosophy, but I do know there's a very compelling piece by Thomas Mann who talks about that, about there not being such a thing as the good German or the bad German after the Second World War. What do you think could be learned, or what should be learned, especially in Germany, from its experience of coming out of a totalitarian regime and understanding not just the broad sweep of history, but the mechanisms, the individual mechanisms that allowed that to happen?
Well, yes, I mean, Mann is certainly one source, but I always turn to Václav Havel on this kind of question, actually, in his wonderful essay, The Power of the Powerless. So what can you do if you live in a totalitarian regime? And Havel famously was a dissident in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, was imprisoned repeatedly for his political activities. So someone who really was roughly treated for standing up to do what he thought was right. And in the 1970s, during the period of so-called normalization in Czechoslovakia, horrible euphemism for a very oppressive clampdown across the entire public sphere, he wrote that that anyone who wants to make change should stand up and find ways to do it, because if you just perpetuate the system, if you let it flow for the sake of an easy life, then you performatively reproduce not only the system, but you reproduce its power. by showing that no one is willing to stand up. And this, so he uses the famous example of the greengrocer putting the placard in his window, workers of the world unite. Nothing in that. He will only have problems if he doesn't do it. Maybe his kids, maybe they don't get to go on holiday to the sea that year. They have to go somewhere else. Maybe the kids don't get accepted for university. There will be costs for not putting that up. But by not putting it up, a sign is made that you're not afraid. And by being not afraid, as Pope John Paul, another from the region, said, be not afraid when standing up in this way. You shine a light on what seems to be the impenetrable facade of the totalitarian regime. And when you shine that light, you see there are cracks in it. There are cracks to work with. And those cracks are actually forged by the resistance of people. And so while one can easily understand the decisions of individuals to either resist or not, to stand up or not, to engage in civil disobedience or not, the cumulative effect of them not doing so, as in Russia, is the perpetuation of that regime. And in this case, with those massively violent external effects. So even if the individual decision is there, there is a collective responsibility to actually do something about this. The collective responsibility does fall on Russians. And I often think also about Richard von Weizsäcker, the German president in the 1980s, said in 1985, he said, it was us, we were also liberated by the defeat of the Nazis. We were liberated from ourselves. We were liberated from our complicity in that. Now, that doesn't mean there's no guilt afterwards. Huge guilt and huge responsibility, but Germans could start to do and be differently. And that's what I think I find particularly hard, that Germans don't take that lesson now and apply it to Russia, and the desperate search for the good Russian, the championing of people like Navalny and his team, who have proven perhaps to be opposed to Putin. But are they a liberal opposition? There's not much liberal about them I can see. And I can't see that they're not the same bunch of Russian chauvinists who would do roughly the same thing, perhaps in a different way. So I think we have to really do engage with that collective responsibility that is there.
And the other aspect, because you've studied and done research and visited Ukraine, I've only been there once, but have the privilege to speak to a lot of Ukrainians. What fascinated me is that Ukrainians are very practical, entrepreneurial, incredibly stubborn, obviously, as well, if you meet them. They don't like authority. They have a sort of seems to be a natural aversion to authority being told what to do. But what they have done is applied these characteristics, and they have innovated a whole range of different things within the informational sphere, the technological sphere, and in various military spheres, as well as civil society and so on. They are, I would say, the democratic entrepreneurs, which perhaps you don't see so much in countries where government is more developed and takes on more of that responsibility. I'd love to get your view on that and why that's such a sort of potent and powerful force. But also, I fear the lessons are not being learnt here, or at least people aren't studying the mechanisms of those Ukrainian experiments in pushing back authoritarian rule and creating a sort of democratic civic space. We're not looking at those lessons in detail enough, and Russian opposition is not looking at those and studying those techniques either.
That's right. I mean, I certainly think there are being military lessons learned from what's going on the battlefield. There's a very big industry of people looking at that. But you're right, in the wider sense of Ukraine's progress that it's made and the resilience that has been shown on a societal level, we're not yet fully picking up the correct lessons. And I and several others are trying to highlight some of those. And we've seen the consolidation of Ukraine's civic nationhood in the face of an amazing threat. Now, you can say the threat was the galvanizing factor for that to a degree, but just because there's a galvanizing effect doesn't mean you have to seize it and actually run with it and do it successfully. So the overcoming of a lot of those religious, linguistic, even ethnic divides within Ukraine that for years people talked about, I always thought was slightly overrated in many discussions, to be honest, some more than others. But nonetheless, those have been really comprehensively overcome at this time because of the realization we have more in common. We need to do this together or we are going to fail. So we either hang together or we will most certainly hang separately, is a lesson Ukrainians have taken from this. We can apply that also to our societies. What is more in common that we have? What are the divides that we should be working to actually overcome rather than indulge? And I think Ukraine's success in integrating the sort of the gay Azov movement, which was something I didn't have on my bingo card a couple of years ago, I have to say, is a real lesson against the kind of identitarian politics that we've seen coming. Some people call it, ultra wokeism or whatever, which I think is a fairly empty phrase. But this focus on the characteristics that you have and can't change and that supposedly define you and divide you from others. Forget that. I mean, this is about a cosmopolitan society, understanding that it can be both cohesive and diverse. And that's a huge lesson we can take. Another part, as you said, is the technological dexterity or flexibility and willingness to move fast and create things, not just move fast and break things. There's been a bit of that too. But that's something we could hugely learn from. And I think a lot of the Ukrainian refugees who came to Germany were a little bit shocked as to the state of the country's digitalization and the access to digital services, whereas they're used to using DIA and other systems in Ukraine. And of course, this is something that we should be learning from. It's a two-way learning street. And I often say that Ukraine is not only the frontier of European security, it's the frontier state of our better future, because it can also be a proving ground for all sorts of technologies that we want to try and which Ukrainians are desperate to get their hands on and are willing to experiment with. And I think we've become a bit too risk averse in a lot of our societies. And if we're going to master the fourfold mega transitions that we face, as I see them, geopolitical, geoeconomic, technological, and ecological, we're going to start to need to be a bit more bold. And Ukrainians can certainly teach us a thing or two about that, as well as offering us the sandbox actually to go and play in.
And harking back to something you said a minute ago, which is really we're trying to reverse back to a kind of stasis, a post fall of the Berlin Wall 1990s sort of stasis, Fukuyama type, end of history period. That's in terms of the geopolitics. But in terms of the military, we seem to be putting all sorts of restrictions on what Ukraine can do. You can't strike Russia with these systems or those systems. You can't do this, you can't do that. We get very uncomfortable when they're, let's say, alternative battlefield methods of Budanov and his Free Russian brigades and so on. They're trying to find opportunities to survive and reverse the status in the war. We seem to be placing Cold War era restrictions on them, extremely paranoid restrictions, and then creating all sorts of assumptions for why those are correct. Why do you think we're doing it? And what do you think the extent of that is?
It's a great question, actually. And I think, relates to a number of things that I've thought about quite a bit and written a bit about in the past, that so much of Western Europe in particular has become post-war in almost every sense. So war had become unthinkable between the states of Western Europe, which is a true testament to the success of the European Union, which was able to flourish under NATO protection, often a part of the story that isn't told quite so loudly. And that war then seems to be a dirty business that you want to put behind you, in such a way that you also forget about the need for victory. And forgetting about the need to victory also comes hand in hand with not thinking that you deserve to win. And I think that's something that is pervasive in a lot of Western European intellectual discourse, the lack of faith in our own system, the lack of belief actually in the liberal system, the idea that it's all a cynical trick, really, that people get conned and, never mind about the fact that other systems have problems, look at all our problems, etc. So I think that lack of belief plus the distance of war to people's experience makes seeking victory seem like a dirty thing, a wrong thing, and just an inappropriate thing to do, something that we've moved far beyond in our civilized state of being. And that is something we have to address, because we might not be interested in war, but war is most certainly interested in us. And if you get stuck in that kind of fight, you're going to want to win it, because the alternative, as Germans will tell you, should be able to tell you, is worse. The other part of this is that, indeed, I think it's Thomas Bagger, who's State Secretary at the German Foreign Office, quoting Ivan Krastev, who said, the German nightmare is war, the Central East European nightmare is occupation. And I put it to Thomas, who's a very smart guy, one of the best foreign policy thinkers here, afterwards, that perhaps he had the wrong nightmare. Perhaps Germans have the wrong nightmare. The nightmare should be expansionary fascist dictatorship, which has to be stopped with war. And that is a lesson I don't think enough Germans took on board. Even with personal friends here and conversations, I've had that very difficult conversation. And as a Brit, obviously, it's both easier and harder to say that. But you do get the credit of having been part of the nation that was part of that war to stop the dictatorship. And when you put it in those terms, people do tend to get it. And so I think there's a messaging problem. Now, to give Boris Pistorius, who we mentioned before, his credit, I think he's starting to try and prepare people for that kind of talk a little bit more here in Germany. He's going to face a very hard problem, even when he mentioned there might be a war in Europe, forgetting actually there is a war in Europe. He received huge criticism for having brought this up. But this is the kind of thing that Ben Hodges has talked about as well, in terms of the need to talk to our populations as if they were adults and actually explain the hard and difficult things we have to do rather than sugarcoating this. Explain there's going to be costs to this. But then my thing that I would add to that is to say, if there's going to be costs and you want people to pay them, you better be able to show them why they're actually not just costs, but they're investments in a better future. And that's the linking work that we haven't done, but it is all connected. Winning is essential to make our future a brighter one, but it's not, it's necessary but insufficient, let's say.
And the sort of last sort of topic areas, really, and this is possibly the most challenging, because everything we've discussed suggests that people, both politicians and the public, don't want to stray too far out of the certainties of their life and their systems and their experience, whereas we're entering a period which is more akin to our grandparents' experience. One half of my family fled rural poverty and civil war in Ireland. The other half fled Vienna weeks before the Second World War. So again, not everyone's experience, but that sense that these things are coming for you. Chaos, repression, murder is coming for you, and you have to do something about it. Is very, very present. If we take the scenario that Putin is engaged in a frozen conflict, he may or may not persuade Western powers to negotiate some kind of peace around that. We may say that as rational on his part. We may see this as a rational outcome to the war. Do you think his calculus is going to be different, though? For him, this may be just a period to rearm, to maybe initiate reforms in Russia, to make their military more efficient and effective, ready for another crack, either a generation later or even 6 to 7 years hence.
Yes, I do. I think that's a real danger, because Russia, under that kind of regime, has nowhere else to go, really. The one part I might take issue with is reforms in Russia. What would be meant by that? I don't know. And I don't know what those might be, really. But in terms of rearming, then yes, I would imagine that would be exactly the way this would go. Partly because ever since Putin changed his model of legitimation from material well-being, which was sort of the Putin 1, the first president, restoring a bit of law and order, increasing material well-being to people, never mind about the politics, you can live a middle-class life in other ways. Since he changed from that to the sort of national chauvinist model of legitimation, waving the flag back to conservative values, etc., this is never satisfied. It only gets worse and it only demands more. It's a bloodthirsty model, and that, which also depends on that old kind of Russian thinking that you're victims and you must be defended. And as Catherine the Great said, I know no way to defend my borders but to extend my borders. And so that kind of thinking comes together in that. So I don't see any reason to presume that Putin would change unless we actively deter and unless we properly contain Russia, because we have a say in this too. And that's something that's often forgotten. They say, the next regime in Russia might be Putin or even worse. It may well be internally, but we don't have to let it be as bad or anything close to as bad internationally. And we need to remember our ordering power should we choose to seize it there. But I think the challenge that you've rightly identified is that too many people think you can live that ordered life of certainty even while all this is going on. And I've got news for them, and I think others are going to have news for them too, that while we live in a world of revanchist, aggressive, hostile regimes whose values are anathema and directly opposed to our democratic liberal values, we will not be able to simply live in that old world of certainty and hang on to things as they were, in the way that they were. We have to actively defend, and we have to also actively go about renewing our societies as well, as I said, to make them that beacon of freedom that can then be spread. And this is what President Zelensky was talking about when he addressed the US Congress at the back end of last year, almost a year ago, in one of the finest speeches among many fine speeches he's given, when he said, this is about the future of the world that we want our grandchildren to live in. Will they live in freedom, or will they live in tyranny? And to make sure this happens, taking another one of his quotes, freedom needs to be better armed than tyranny. It does need to be materially better armed, but we need to arm ourselves with the right mindset, with the mindset to defend, but also to make good on the promise of democracy, to make it true to its word, and to actually live up to what we claim is the material and moral superiority of our system, and to share that better among our societies. And of course, this will come to no surprise to anyone on Twitter that this is the three pillars really of what I call the new idealism in international politics, which I see as being something of a grand strategy for liberal democracies going forward, to defend, renew, and spread liberal democracy. And we've got a lot of work to do on that. And I think one of the certainties we have to challenge as well is our faith in neoliberal economics, both domestically and internationally. Now, internationally, it's been shaken to its core, but domestically, we still don't quite have an alternative to this. Even though that might be dead, the new cannot yet quite be born. So that's where a lot of the work and effort, I think, needs to be put in, to give not certainty, but to give hope, to actually give the hope of progress again to more people in our societies. With that in mind, they have a task to be part of. They have a quest to be part of. And this is something else that Václav Havel talked about, drawing on a lot of Hinterground. The idea of Europe as a task to be built, to be engaged in, a projet pour la vie, a project for life, as Jean-Paul Sartre may have called it. This is something I think we've lost the idea of. And so rather than that sort of drifting, literally hopeless neoliberalism of recent times, we need to re-engage hope if we're to defend, renew, and spread liberal democracy.
And it has been commented that Mearsheimer, amongst others, and the realist school do seem to, despite the patent absurdities and flaws or simplicity of some of the models that are used there, that does still seem to be debated widely and hold some sway, at least in strategic decision making. Do you see this idealism model as being in a sort of, a strong challenger to that, and even a replacement to what I call a fairly amoral way of interpreting global affairs?
Well, you're actually being generous to realism by calling it amoral. I mean, a lot of the history of realism shows that in its worst parts, it's distinctly immoral. And this is what I'd say, not enough people know the history of realism as an approach to international relations. Now, the greatest trick the IR devil ever pulled was letting realism call itself realism, because who doesn't want to be realistic? What's the alternative? It's being unrealistic. It's being utopian. It's being woolly-headed, whatever else, right? But the notion that realism is somehow the real way of the world is nonsense. It's an imposition of a particular view of the world onto it in order to make it in a certain way, in the same way that any other academic theory of politics and of society is. So it's no different than the others. It just has a different name. Now, its history, and there's a wonderful book I'd recommend to your readers called The Atlantic Realists by a guy called Matthew Spector, who's a scholar of this. He shows realism's entanglement with the histories of imperialism and chauvinism in a very, very tangible way, and that this always authorized things like spheres of influence, and a sphere of influence being where a great power, a big power, has the right to do what it wants within its own backyard. Never mind if the people who live there don't want that, have no say in it, they're weak, so they must accept this. And other great powers shouldn't intervene, or other powers at all shouldn't intervene to stop that, because it is the natural right of some to rule over others. Now, that is ridiculous. For anyone who is a believer in liberalism of any kind, or in democracy or freedom of any kind, or in the equality of people, that should have been anathema to us a long time ago. The fact that it isn't shows how badly understood international politics is a lot of the time, but also how there is a certain will to this kind of cynical attitude that pervades some policymakers, some academics, and others to say, I can stomach this, I can take this as the world as it really is, not as you wish it would be. There are all sorts of claims in this about human nature, which are extremely flawed. I mean, anyone who's going to make a claim about human nature is going to run into a lot of problems when it actually meets reality. And this is the problem the realists have come up with, is that the world doesn't fit their theory, but it's not the world that's wrong, or it's not their theory that's wrong, it's the world that's wrong. And I mean, that tells you quite a lot of what you need to know about that. So yes, I see neo-idealism as a big challenge to this, but it does draw on the better traditions of international relations. It just tries to make them a bit more thoroughgoing, a bit more consistent. It says you can have progress, but unlike the lazy reading of the end of history, that doesn't come automatically. You have to work at it. You have to strive at it. And this is why it's based on the power of values conceived as ideals to strive for. The striving is part of it, and the progress towards them is a big part of it. And that's something that we can all engage with together. And it's something we have seen people engaging with since the beginning of the war. This has been one of the most encouraging things about the last 2 years, to see so many ordinary people. That great phrase, ordinary people. Who are those ordinary people? It's us. Stand up and be counted. Stand up and do more and better.
And this leads, I guess, to some difficult speculation, because if supply of A1M1 Abrams, ATACMS, if we've had to struggle over and over, and you'll remember the campaign to free the leopards and so on, it's been like pulling teeth all the way through. There are, as we approach an endgame, going to be some far more difficult decisions to make, and it seems that we bottle these or refuse to grasp the nettle. Decisions such as putting boots on the ground to protect the liberated Ukrainian territory, creating no-fly zones, potentially even allowing Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory if Russia continues to fire missiles or even use its own territory as logistics hubs. It's fairly absurd at the moment that Ukraine can only hit Russian logistics at the point where it crosses over to occupied territory. It'd be far more effective to allow it to take it out in Russian territory. Are we going to have to embrace some of these things that we are at the moment not even really properly discussing?
Yes, I think we are, and there's all sorts of choices though within that spectrum of options that you mentioned, and we certainly haven't anywhere near exhausted the supply of things we can give to Ukraine. For one thing, in certain fields we have, in others we haven't. There's plenty more that could be given. Air power, for example. So even before, a long way before we would get to any discussion of putting boots on the ground, there is a lot more that we could and frankly should be doing to help Ukraine win. Now, the way to that, again, it's like your former guest, Ben Hodges, and others talking recently to German generals, Heinrich Braus and Eberhard Bühler, talking about how to make Crimea untenable. And if you make Crimea untenable for Russians, then I think you're going to start to see the end of the war a lot quicker. And that is something that is firmly within our gift to be able to do. Does that solve the longer term problem? No. And as you said, what about peacekeeping in the future and so on? And I and others have argued that the only meaningful security guarantee in the long term for Ukraine is NATO membership. And we would have to consider a situation where not all of the territory of Ukraine is under the control of Kiev, and we would still be able to give NATO membership. Now, there are many objections to that made, rules, precedents, etc. But the country I'm sitting in is testament to how you can be creative with those rules and precedents if the political will is there to do it. And simply saying we followed the rules and destroyed Europe is not really a great logic, I think. So actually understanding what the rules are there to do is really important. So we have to think about how to get Ukraine into NATO. Now, there can be intermediate steps to that as well. I proposed extending the Joint Expeditionary Force, for example, a northern alliance of European countries, as well as the UK. So you have a nuclear power involved, highly capable set of countries who have a mutual defense agreement. Now, you could include Ukraine into that, which would provide a path into NATO, not an alternative to it, which is extremely important as well. There can be no alternative eventually to NATO membership. But as a way of bringing Ukraine closer and providing some kind of actually meaningful security provision in the meantime, it's not a bad option. There are others, and there'll be other proposals that are made, but we have to find that way. If we don't get Ukraine into NATO, we won't get Ukraine into the European Union. I'm fairly sure about that. And the sequencing of that is key, because the reconstruction will be much more difficult, much more costly. There will be much more competition for resources. Reforms will prove more difficult to make. The reward and reform cycle won't be as effective if we do that. There's some willingness to be, I think, innovative in the European Union as to how to bring Ukraine in, differentiated sectoral integration, so going faster in some areas than others, allowing Ukraine to, in effect, join in some areas before it does others. That's great. That's good. But it is all predicated on the security situation. And so you need both. You need NATO for Ukraine to survive, and you need the EU for Ukraine to thrive. And we have to be thinking how to get there. Because if we don't, we won't have a stable and secure Europe. We will have an unstable and insecure Europe that will require us to spend huge proportions of GDP on defense. To put a point on that, Germany is having trouble getting to 2% of GDP, the NATO target. A lot of that 2%, when it does get there, this year and next year and the year after, we'll see about after that, will be spent on paying the pensions of ex-DDR soldiers. A lot of it will be spent on other various accounting fixes and things that will deter precisely no one. What we should be looking at is the stuff we need and how much of it to actively deter Russia in a case that we didn't let Ukraine win. Well, welcome to the 3.5% or 4% target and a conversation about funding your own nuclear deterrent that's going to cost you an enormous amount more and gain you a lot less than getting Ukraine's victory, getting Ukraine into NATO and into the EU.
It sounds like we've got a big leap to go from doing things right to doing the right thing for Ukraine.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Or even you could say we've done a lot of the right things, but now we need to do it right. And we need to do it right in the way that will take us into that better future, and actually have a strategic approach to it, a better strategic approach than muddling through, which is what we've got so far.
That's tremendous clarity, Ben. Thank you so much for speaking to the audience about these issues. Really brought so many of these themes together, I think crystallized them and given a clear way forward. Of course, I very much hope to repeat that. So much is happening. I'm sure in a few months there'll be plenty more to talk about. But thank you so much for agreeing to come on the channel and sharing your precious time and insights.
Jonathan, it's been a real pleasure. Those were great questions, and I'd love to come on anytime.